They thought firing me would silence the inconvenient voice that kept questioning their reckless decisions. Instead, they handed me the perfect position to watch their $2.8 billion merger crumble from the inside, taking their reputations and careers down with it. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one you create yourself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Sterling didn't even have the courtesy to look me in the eye when she delivered the news. We were sitting in the sterile conference room on the 32nd floor of Pinnacle Financial, the same room where I'd presented quarterly risk assessments for the past 8 years. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Elena, we've decided to restructure the compliance department," she said, her manicured fingers drumming against a manila folder that I suspected contained my termination paperwork. Her voice carried that practiced corporate tone, the one they teach in executive seminars about delivering bad news without accepting responsibility. "Your approach has become increasingly difficult to align with our new strategic direction." Difficult. That was the word they used when someone refused to rubber stamp their questionable decisions. When someone actually read the fine print and pointed out the glaring red flags they preferred to ignore. When someone had the audacity to prioritize regulatory compliance over quarterly bonuses. I'd been difficult when I flagged the suspicious overseas transactions that Morgan Blackwell, our chief financial officer, had been pushing through without proper documentation. Difficult when I questioned the accelerated timeline for the Meridian Holdings acquisition. Difficult when I insisted on conducting thorough due diligence instead of rushing headlong into what Rebecca and the board saw as the deal of the century. "I see," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "And when exactly does this restructuring take effect?" "Immediately." She finally met my eyes, and I saw something there that might have been guilt, quickly masked by corporate determination. "Security will escort you to collect your personal items. Your access cards have already been deactivated." 8 years. 8 years of 60-hour weeks. Of catching discrepancies that saved the company millions in fines. Of building a compliance framework that had earned Pinnacle recognition from regulatory bodies across 3 states. And this was how it ended. With a 20-minute meeting and a security escort. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were firing their head of compliance just weeks before closing the largest merger in the company's history. A merger I'd spent months analyzing, finding issue after issue that they systematically chose to ignore. Rebecca and Morgan were so eager to secure their golden parachutes that they'd convinced themselves my concerns were just bureaucratic roadblocks rather than legitimate warnings. As I walked through the familiar hallways for the last time, past the cubicles where my former colleagues studiously avoided eye contact, I couldn't help but smile. They thought they were eliminating a problem, but they had no idea what they'd actually done. In their haste to silence me, they'd overlooked one crucial detail. I wasn't just Pinnacle's head of compliance. I was also a licensed forensic accountant with specialized training in merger and acquisition fraud detection. More importantly, I had copies of everything. Every suspicious transaction, every rushed approval, every corner they'd cut in their desperation to close the Meridian deal. It was all meticulously documented in my personal files, backed up on encrypted drives, and organized with the same obsessive attention to detail that had made me so difficult to work with. The security guard, a kind man named Thomas who'd always greeted me warmly in the lobby, seemed genuinely apologetic as he watched me pack my personal items. "I'm sorry about this, Ms. Rodriguez," he said quietly. "This place won't be the same without you." I smiled at him as I carefully placed my diplomas and certifications into a cardboard box. "Don't worry, Thomas. I have a feeling things are about to get very interesting around here." What Rebecca and Morgan didn't know, what they couldn't have known because they'd been too focused on their stock options to pay attention, was that I'd been conducting my own parallel investigation into Meridian Holdings for months. It had started as routine due diligence, but the deeper I dug, the more concerning the picture became. Meridian's financials were impressive on the surface. A mid-sized investment firm with offices in Chicago, Atlanta, and Miami, they'd shown consistent growth over the past 5 years. Their client roster included several Fortune 500 companies, and their reputation in the industry was solid. On paper, they were exactly the kind of acquisition target that would take Pinnacle to the next level. But papers could lie, especially when the people reviewing them were more interested in completion bonuses than completion accuracy. I'd discovered discrepancies in Meridian's reported assets, inconsistencies in their client agreements, and, most damning of all, a complex web of shell companies that seemed designed to obscure the true source of their profits. When I'd brought these concerns to Rebecca and Morgan, they'd dismissed them as minor technicalities that could be resolved post-merger. "Elena, you're overthinking this," Morgan had said during our last meeting, his patronizing tone making my skin crawl. "Meridian has been vetted by 3 different firms. Their books are clean. Sometimes you need to trust the process instead of trying to find problems where none exist." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But I knew problems existed. I could feel them in the pit of my stomach every time I reviewed another piece of documentation. The shell companies weren't just red flags. They were warning sirens. And the more I investigated, the more certain I became that Pinnacle was walking into a trap. The evening of my termination, I sat in my home office reviewing everything I'd compiled. Spreadsheets filled with financial data, organizational charts mapping Meridian's complex corporate structure, email chains showing Rebecca and Morgan's increasingly desperate attempts to fast-track the deal. It was all there, a complete picture of corporate negligence dressed up as strategic vision. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen, one of the junior analysts who'd worked closely with me. "Can't believe they let you go. This place is going to fall apart without you. Coffee tomorrow?" I stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "Rain check on coffee. I have some research to finish." And I did. Because while Rebecca and Morgan thought they'd solved their problem by eliminating the voice of caution, they'd actually created a much bigger one. They'd given me unlimited time to investigate, no corporate oversight to constrain my methods, and most importantly, absolutely no loyalty left to the company that had betrayed me. The merger was scheduled to close in 6 weeks. The regulatory approvals were nearly complete, the financing was arranged, and the press releases were already drafted. Everyone at Pinnacle was celebrating what they saw as a done deal, completely unaware that their former head of compliance was about to become their worst nightmare. I opened a new document on my laptop and began typing. At the top of the page, I wrote, "Confidential report. Financial irregularities and regulatory violations in the proposed Pinnacle Meridian merger." Below that, I added a subtitle, "Prepared by Elena Rodriguez, CPA, CFE, former head of compliance, Pinnacle Financial." Then I began writing the report that would destroy them all. The first section focused on Meridian's shell company network. I had traced the ownership structures through 6 different jurisdictions, following a paper trail that led to some very interesting connections. Connections that Pinnacle's expensive legal team had somehow missed in their rush to close the deal. The second section detailed the financial discrepancies I'd uncovered. Revenue recognition issues, suspicious transaction timing, and what appeared to be a sophisticated scheme to inflate Meridian's assets through circular transactions between related entities. Any one of these issues should have been enough to pause the merger. Collectively, they painted a picture of systemic fraud. The third section was perhaps the most damaging. It outlined the specific regulatory violations that the merger would likely trigger, complete with citations to relevant statutes and case law. I'd identified at least 12 separate areas where the combined entity would be in violation of federal banking regulations, securities laws, and anti-money laundering requirements. But the fourth section was my masterpiece. It connected all the dots, showing how Rebecca and Morgan's rush to close the deal had blinded them to obvious warning signs. I documented every meeting where I'd raised concerns, every email where I'd requested additional due diligence, every instance where my recommendations had been dismissed or overruled. It was a comprehensive indictment of corporate negligence, and it was bulletproof. As I worked through the night, I thought about all the times Rebecca had condescendingly explained to me that I needed to be more of a team player. All the occasions when Morgan had implied that my attention to detail was holding back the company's growth. They'd painted me as an obstacle to progress, a bureaucratic dinosaur who couldn't adapt to the fast-paced world of modern finance. They had no idea that their dinosaur had teeth. The next morning, I made copies of everything. Physical copies stored in my safe deposit box, digital copies on encrypted drives hidden in various locations, and backup files stored in secure cloud servers. If Rebecca and Morgan thought they could bury this by targeting me personally, they were about to learn how wrong they were. Then I began making phone calls. The first call went to Jennifer Walsh at the Federal Reserve's Division of Banking, Supervision, and Regulation. Jennifer and I had worked together on several compliance issues over the years, and she knew my reputation for thoroughness and accuracy. "Elena, I heard about what happened at Pinnacle," she said after I'd explained the reason for my call. "I can't say I'm surprised. Rebecca Sterling has always struck me as someone who views regulations as suggestions rather than requirements." "That's actually why I'm calling," I replied. "I've uncovered some information about their pending merger that I think you need to see." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What kind of information?" "The kind that suggests Pinnacle is about to acquire a company with serious regulatory and financial issues. The kind that could expose the entire organization to criminal liability." Another pause, longer this time. "Can you send me what you have?" "I'll have a comprehensive report on your desk by end of business today." The second call went to Marcus Thompson at the Securities and Exchange Commission. Marcus had been investigating suspicious trading patterns in the financial sector for over a decade, and he had a particular interest in merger-related fraud. "You're telling me that Pinnacle's due diligence missed all of this?" he asked after I'd given him the overview. "I'm telling you they chose to ignore it," I corrected. "I flagged every single one of these issues and I was told I was being overly cautious. And now they've fired you. 2 days ago. Apparently, I was too difficult to work with." Marcus chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Difficult. That's what they always say when someone actually does their job. Send me everything you have, Elena. If this is as bad as you're describing, we're going to need to move fast." The third call was to David Park at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. David specialized in anti-money laundering investigations, and I had a feeling he'd be very interested in Meridian's complex network of offshore entities. By noon, I'd sent detailed reports to 6 different regulatory agencies, 3 federal prosecutors' offices, and 2 investigative journalists who specialized in financial crime reporting. Each report was carefully tailored to the recipient's specific jurisdiction and interests, but they all told the same story. Pinnacle Financial was rushing headlong into a merger that would likely result in criminal charges for everyone involved. Then I sat back and waited for the phone to ring. The phone started ringing at 7:43 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, exactly 5 days after I'd sent out my reports. I was in my kitchen, brewing my second cup of coffee and watching the morning news, when the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize with a Washington, D.C. area code. "Ms. Rodriguez, this is Agent Patricia Collins with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I believe you recently submitted some information regarding Pinnacle Financial and their proposed merger with Meridian Holdings." My heart rate quickened, but I kept my voice steady. "Yes, that's correct. We need to meet. Today, if possible. What you've uncovered has triggered multiple federal investigations, and we're going to need your full cooperation." Within 6 hours, I was sitting in a conference room at the FBI's field office, surrounded by agents, prosecutors, and regulatory officials who were treating my documentation like pieces of a puzzle they'd been trying to solve for months. It turned out that Meridian Holdings had been on their radar for over a year, but they'd never been able to gather enough evidence to build a solid case. Agent Collins spread my financial analysis across the conference table like a roadmap to corruption. "This is extraordinary work, Ms. Rodriguez. You've connected patterns that our own forensic accountants missed. How long did it take you to put this together?" "About 4 months of deep investigation," I replied. Though I started noticing irregularities almost immediately when the merger was first proposed. And Pinnacle's executives ignored all of this? I pulled out my phone and showed them the email chain I'd carefully preserved. Not ignored. Actively dismissed. Rebecca Sterling told me I was, quote, creating problems where none existed. Morgan Blackwell accused me of being obstructionist and suggested I didn't understand the, quote, bigger picture of modern finance. Special Prosecutor James Mitchell leaned forward, his expression grim. What they didn't understand is that you were documenting evidence of what appears to be a massive money laundering operation. Meridian Holdings isn't just financially troubled. They're a front for moving illegal funds through legitimate investment channels. The pieces were falling into place in ways that even I hadn't fully anticipated. My investigation had revealed the shell companies and financial irregularities, but the federal task force had been tracking the criminal enterprise behind them. Meridian's impressive client roster wasn't just legitimate businesses. It included several organizations that were under investigation for everything from tax evasion to international drug trafficking. The beautiful irony, Agent Collins continued, is that Pinnacle was so eager to acquire Meridian that they never bothered to properly vet their client base. If this merger had gone through, Rebecca Sterling and Morgan Blackwell would have become accessories to federal crimes they didn't even know were being committed. Over the next several hours, I learned the full scope of what my termination had set in motion. The Securities and Exchange Commission had already issued a temporary halt on the merger pending investigation. The Federal Reserve had opened a formal inquiry into Pinnacle's risk management practices. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network had frozen several of Meridian's accounts, while they traced the source of suspicious transactions. But perhaps most satisfying of all, the Department of Justice was preparing criminal charges against Meridian's leadership and considering charges against Pinnacle's executives for willful negligence in their due diligence process. "We're going to need you to testify," Prosecutor Mitchell explained. "Your documentation proves that Pinnacle had access to information that should have stopped this merger months ago. The fact that they fired you for raising these concerns actually strengthens our case against them." I smiled for the first time in weeks. I'd be honored to testify. That evening, I drove home with a strange sense of vindication. For months, I'd felt like I was fighting a losing battle against corporate arrogance and willful blindness. Rebecca and Morgan had made me feel like I was the problem, like my insistence on following proper procedures was somehow holding back progress and innovation. Now I understood that I hadn't been holding back progress. I'd been preventing a catastrophe. My phone had been buzzing with messages all day. Sarah Chen had texted 3 times asking if I'd heard the rumors about federal agents visiting Pinnacle's offices. My former colleague David Martinez had called to tell me that the entire executive floor was in chaos, with lawyers coming and going at all hours. But the most interesting message came from an unknown number. "Elena, this is Rebecca Sterling. We need to talk. Please call me." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. The next morning brought news that exceeded even my expectations. The Wall Street Journal's front page featured a headline that made my coffee taste like victory. "Major bank merger collapses amid federal investigation. Executives face criminal charges." The article, written by investigative reporter Amanda Foster, laid out the entire scandal in devastating detail. She'd clearly had access to some of my documentation, though she'd protected my identity as a source. The piece painted Pinnacle's leadership as either criminally negligent or willfully corrupt, describing how they'd ignored, quote, numerous red flags raised by internal compliance staff in their rush to complete the acquisition. My favorite paragraph read, according to sources familiar with the investigation, Pinnacle's former head of compliance had repeatedly warned executives about irregularities in Meridian's financial structure, only to be dismissed as, quote, difficult and, quote, obstructionist. The executive was reportedly terminated just weeks before the scheduled merger closing, a decision that federal investigators now view as potential evidence of consciousness of guilt. I was pouring myself a celebratory glass of wine when my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a number I recognized, the main line at Pinnacle Financial. Elena Rodriguez speaking. "Ms. Rodriguez, this is Jonathan Hayes, outside counsel for Pinnacle Financial. I represent the board of directors in this matter." I took a sip of wine before responding. "How can I help you, Mr. Hayes?" I think you know why I'm calling. My clients are facing a very serious situation, and they believe there may have been some misunderstandings about your termination. Misunderstandings? The board has asked me to extend an offer for you to return to your position, with a significant increase in compensation and expanded authority over all compliance matters. They're prepared to offer you a 40% salary increase, full executive benefits, and a formal apology for any miscommunication that may have occurred. I couldn't help but laugh. Mr. Hayes, are you familiar with the concept of closing the barn door after the horses have escaped? There was a pause on the other end. Ms. Rodriguez, I understand you may have some concerns about how you were treated, but my clients are prepared to make this right. They value your expertise and want to move forward constructively. Your clients fired me for doing my job. They dismissed every concern I raised, ignored every warning I provided, and escorted me out of the building like a criminal. Now that their reckless behavior has exposed them to federal criminal charges, they want me to come back and help clean up their mess? The board recognizes that mistakes were made. Mr. Hayes, let me stop you right there. This wasn't a mistake. This was a calculated decision to prioritize short-term profits over regulatory compliance and basic due diligence. Your clients thought they could silence inconvenient truths by firing the person pointing them out. They were wrong. Another pause, longer this time. What would it take for you to consider returning? I walked to my window and looked out at the city skyline, thinking about all the nights I'd worked late trying to protect a company that ultimately didn't want protection. There's nothing you could offer me, Mr. Hayes, but please give the board a message from me. Of course. Tell them that Elena Rodriguez, the difficult compliance officer they were so eager to get rid of, says hello. And remind them that sometimes the most expensive employee to fire is the one who was trying to save you from yourself. I hung up and poured myself another glass of wine. The following weeks brought a cascade of developments that felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. The SEC expanded their investigation to include other recent acquisitions Pinnacle had completed, finding similar patterns of inadequate due diligence. The Federal Reserve imposed immediate restrictions on Pinnacle's lending activities pending a comprehensive review of their risk management practices. Most dramatically, a federal grand jury indicted Morgan Blackwell on charges of bank fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The indictment alleged that he had knowingly ignored evidence of criminal activity at Meridian Holdings in order to secure personal bonuses tied to the merger's completion. Rebecca Sterling fared slightly better, avoiding criminal charges but facing a civil lawsuit from shareholders who alleged that her negligent management had exposed the company to massive financial and reputational damage. She resigned from her position on a Friday afternoon, issuing a statement that blamed unforeseen regulatory complexities for the merger's failure. I read her resignation letter with particular interest, noting how she managed to avoid taking any personal responsibility for the debacle she'd created. Even in defeat, Rebecca couldn't acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the compliance officer she'd dismissed as difficult had been trying to save her career. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd become something of a celebrity in the compliance community. Professional organizations were inviting me to speak at conferences about the importance of independent risk assessment. Regulatory agencies were consulting me on best practices for merger oversight. Headhunters were calling daily with offers from companies that wanted someone with my combination of technical expertise and demonstrated integrity. But perhaps the most satisfying recognition came from an unexpected source. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners announced that they were presenting me with their annual Sentinel Award, given to professionals who demonstrate exceptional courage in exposing financial crimes despite personal and professional risks. Ms. Rodriguez exemplifies the highest standards of our profession, the award citation read. In the face of corporate pressure and personal retaliation, she maintained her commitment to truth and transparency, ultimately preventing a merger that would have facilitated money laundering and exposed innocent investors to criminal liability. The award ceremony was held at a gala dinner in Chicago, attended by fraud examiners, regulatory officials, and compliance professionals from across the country. As I stood at the podium accepting the award, I looked out at an audience of people who understood exactly what I'd been through. 6 months ago, I was told that my attention to detail was a liability, I said into the microphone. That my insistence on following proper procedures was holding back progress, that my questions were inconvenient and my concerns were overblown. I paused, looking directly at the camera that was recording the ceremony. Today I want to speak directly to every compliance professional, every auditor, every risk manager who has ever been told they're being difficult for doing their job. Your vigilance matters. Your questions matter. Your integrity matters. And when powerful people try to silence you for telling uncomfortable truths, remember that sometimes the most dangerous position you can be in is the one where you know too much and care too little about the consequences of speaking up. The audience erupted in applause, but I wasn't finished. To the executives who think they can eliminate oversight by eliminating the people providing it, I have a simple message. We're not going away. We're not backing down. And we're not going to let you destroy the integrity of our financial system for the sake of your quarterly bonuses. You may have the power to fire us, but you don't have the power to silence us. And sometimes, the person you underestimate the most is the one who brings your entire house of cards crashing down. As I left the stage, I thought about Rebecca Sterling and Morgan Blackwell, probably watching the ceremony from their respective legal troubles. I wondered if they finally understood that their difficult employee hadn't been the problem after all. She'd been the solution they were too arrogant to accept. The next morning, I started my new job as Chief Risk Officer at Atlantic Trust, a position that came with not just a significant salary increase, but something far more valuable, a mandate to ask hard questions and the authority to demand honest answers. Sometimes getting fired is the best thing that can happen to your career. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.